I was at a bar when a guy started bragging about his special forces career to my date. He didn't realize I was actually his commanding officer. I'd been on 3 promising dates with Cassidy before we decided to check out Wesley's trendy downtown bar. She was smart, funny, and didn't ask too many questions about my vague government consulting job. That alone made her different from most women I dated since leaving active military service. We grabbed a high-top table near the bar's exposed brick wall. The place was packed for a Thursday night, with ambient lighting that made everyone look slightly better than they actually did. Janelle, the bartender, brought over our drinks and a menu. Cassidy ordered some kind of fruity cocktail while I stuck with beer. So the puppy finally stopped crying after I removed the thorn, Cassidy said, continuing her story about the veterinary clinic where she worked. The owner was so relieved he brought us all coffee the next day. I laughed at the right moments and asked appropriate follow-up questions. It was refreshing to hear someone talk about a job that actually helped living things, rather than the work I'd done for years. The commotion from the bar area grew louder. 2 guys were hitting on a pair of women who looked increasingly uncomfortable. The taller of the men, probably mid-20s with military short hair, leaned in too close to one of the women. She shifted away while her friend checked her phone, the universal signal for "please rescue me." The women eventually made their excuses and left. The rejected guys scanned the room for new targets. I noticed immediately when their attention landed on our table, specifically on Cassidy. The taller one approached with practiced confidence. His friend hung back, watching with an encouraging smile. "Hey there, I'm Blake," he said, flashing what he clearly thought was a winning smile at Cassidy. "Mind if we join you? My buddy Seth and I just got back from overseas." Cassidy, being polite, smiled and gestured to the empty chairs. I kept my expression neutral while taking a slow sip of beer. "I'm Cassidy, and this is my date," she said, introducing me with a gesture. Blake gave me a quick nod before focusing entirely on her again. "So what do you do?" he asked Cassidy, leaning forward with exaggerated interest. "I'm a veterinary technician," she replied. "What about you? You mentioned being overseas?" Blake straightened his shoulders. "Yeah, just got back from a deployment. Special forces. Can't talk about most of it. You know how it is." I noticed the first inconsistency immediately. His haircut was regulation, but his posture was too practiced, like someone imitating military bearing rather than living it. "That must be fascinating," Cassidy said, genuinely interested. "What's it like being in special forces?" Blake launched into a story about training and deployments. I silently noted each technical term he used correctly, alongside the ones he mangled. "We were operating in some pretty hot zones," Blake continued. 2 years of classified ops in Afghanistan. Pretty intense stuff. Seth nodded along, occasionally adding, "That's right," or "Tell them about that time in Kandahar." Blake ordered another round from Janelle, insisting on paying. The gesture seemed designed to buy himself more time with Cassidy. "Our colonel was this hard-ass from Texas," Blake said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Made us run 5 miles in full gear just because someone's boots weren't shined properly." I mentally cataloged each factual error while maintaining a neutral expression. His timeline was wrong. His equipment references were outdated. His description of command structure was pure Hollywood. "Did you see much combat?" Cassidy asked, still engaged in the conversation. Blake nodded solemnly. "More than I care to remember. But that's the job, you know? You train for it, but nothing prepares you for the real thing." I watched him weave truth and fiction together with impressive skill. He knew enough terminology to fool civilians, but was making critical mistakes no actual service member would make. The stories grew more elaborate with each passing minute. Blake described missions that sounded pulled from action movies rather than actual military operations. I nursed my beer and waited. The night was young, and Blake was digging himself into a hole he wouldn't be able to climb out of. Blake leaned back in his chair and took a long swig of his beer. He fixed his gaze on Cassidy with practiced intensity. "So yeah, I was stationed at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan just last year. Got back from my 3rd tour in 2023, he said. I nearly choked on my drink. The U.S. had completely withdrawn from Afghanistan in 2021. Bagram had been abandoned long before 2023. "That must have been intense," Cassidy replied, clearly impressed. "What kind of equipment did you use over there?" Blake launched into a detailed description of gear that hadn't been standard issue for over a decade. He mentioned weapon systems that had been phased out years ago, as if they were cutting-edge technology. "We were running missions with full Molly gear and those new night vision goggles that can see through walls," he said confidently. I kept my face neutral while mentally noting each fabrication. No night vision technology could see through walls. That was pure science fiction. "Did you see much combat?" Cassidy asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Blake nodded solemnly. "More than most. We ran reconnaissance in the Khorasan Valley for weeks at a time. High-risk extractions in places I can't even name." I knew for a fact that there was no Khorasan Valley in Afghanistan. The name sounded vaguely Middle Eastern enough to fool a civilian, but it was complete nonsense. "What about medals?" Cassidy asked. "Did you receive any commendations?" Seth jumped in before Blake could answer. "Tell her about your Bronze Star, man. That firefight was insane." Blake shot his friend a look of fake modesty. "It wasn't that big a deal. Just did what anyone would do when your team is pinned down. Ran across open terrain under heavy fire to drag 2 wounded men to safety." I fought to keep my expression neutral. He was describing a scene straight out of a war movie, not actual combat operations. "We lost good men that day," Blake continued, his voice dropping dramatically. "But leadership said my actions saved the mission." Seth nodded enthusiastically. "Blake's too humble. He's a genuine hero." Blake pulled out his phone suddenly. "I've got some photos from basic training if you want to see." He swiped through several pictures of himself in uniform. The images showed a younger Blake standing at parade rest, clearly from basic training. I got a clear look at his face in the photos. Recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew this guy. Under the table, I discreetly texted my contact, Andre. Guy at bar, claiming SF experience. Name Blake. Check Fort Benning washouts from 3 years ago. Blake continued showing Cassidy photos while I waited for a response. My phone vibrated less than 2 minutes later. Blake Harmon, failed basic at week 6. Discharged for failure to adapt. Never made it past Fort Benning. The memories clicked into place. Blake had been one of my recruits 3 years ago. He'd washed out of basic training after just 6 weeks. He'd never even completed initial entry training, let alone joined special forces. This was from my first deployment, Blake was saying, showing Cassidy a photo that was clearly taken stateside. We were about to head out on a classified operation. I remembered Blake now. He'd struggled with basic fitness requirements and couldn't handle the stress of training. He'd been discharged for failure to adapt, military terminology, for someone who simply couldn't meet the standards. Our team was responsible for high-value target extraction, Blake continued, weaving an increasingly elaborate tale. Can't talk about specifics, but let's just say some very dangerous people are no longer a threat. Cassidy was completely taken in. She asked thoughtful questions that Blake answered with rehearsed confidence. I debated my next move carefully. I could expose him right now, humiliate him in front of everyone, but that seemed unnecessarily cruel, even for someone stealing valor like this. So what was your MOS? I asked casually, using the military abbreviation for military occupational specialty. Blake hesitated for just a fraction of a second. 18 Bravo, Special Forces Weapons Sergeant. Another lie. He'd never made it far enough to be assigned any MOS, let alone the Elite 18B designation. Interesting, I replied, keeping my tone conversational. I did some work with 18 series guys back in the day. Blake's expression flickered with uncertainty. Oh yeah? Who'd you serve with? I took a slow sip of my beer. 5th group, mainly. You? Mostly 3rd, he replied quickly. Too quickly. But I moved around a lot. Special assignments. I nodded as if this made perfect sense. In reality, Blake was digging himself deeper with every word. Seth seemed oblivious to the tension, still backing up Blake's stories with enthusiastic support. Cassidy looked between us, sensing something wasn't quite right. I decided to let Blake continue his charade a bit longer. I was curious just how elaborate his fictional military career had become. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but headed straight for the back hallway instead. I needed confirmation before confronting Blake. The music faded as I pulled out my phone and called Terrence, my former XO who now worked in personnel. Need info on a washout named Blake Harmon, Fort Benning, about 3 years ago, I said when he answered. Terrence didn't waste time with questions. Give me 2 minutes. I leaned against the wall and waited. My phone buzzed exactly 8 seconds later. Got him. Blake Harmon, age 24, failed to complete basic training, discharged after 6 weeks for failure to adapt, couldn't handle the physical requirements or stress of training, attitude problems with drill instructors, never made it to AIT, let alone Special Forces selection. Any disciplinary issues after discharge? I asked. Nothing official, but notes indicate he's been spotted at bars near bases, wearing uniform pieces and telling war stories. Several complaints about him claiming combat experience. I thanked Terrence and headed back to the table. Blake was in the middle of describing what he claimed was a classified operation in Syria. We infiltrated under cover of darkness, Blake said, leaning closer to Cassidy. My team was tasked with extracting a high-value intelligence asset from deep in enemy territory. I slid back into my seat and took a sip of my beer. What insertion method did you use? Blake hesitated for a split second. Halo jump, high altitude, low opening, standard for those kinds of operations. Interesting. What altitude did you drop from? I asked casually. Blake shifted in his seat. 30,000 feet. Oxygen was required. I nodded as if this made perfect sense. In reality, no halo jumps were conducted from that altitude. It was a rookie mistake. What about your equipment loadout? Must have been heavy for that kind of mission. I pressed. Blake started listing gear, mixing up current and outdated equipment names. His confident tone faltered as I asked increasingly specific questions. Cassidy looked between us with growing confusion. How do you know so much about this stuff? She asked me. I smiled. My government consulting work involves military training oversight. I spend a lot of time with special forces units. Blake's face paled slightly. He tried redirecting the conversation. So, anyway, after we secured the target, we had to fight our way to the extraction point. Heavy resistance the whole way. Which unit were you with at Fort Benning? I asked, dropping the name deliberately. Blake froze. Recognition flashed in his eyes as he realized I might know his actual background. I went through training there, but my unit assignments are classified, he stammered. That's funny because I distinctly remember a training exercise there 3 years ago. The one where recruits had to complete a 5-mile run in full gear. Several didn't make it. One quit halfway through. Said it was too hard. Blake's confident facade crumbled. Seth looked confused, glancing between us. I should probably get going, Blake said suddenly. Early morning tomorrow. Training stuff, you know how it is. Actually, I do know how it is, I said, making direct eye contact. Staff Sergeant James Harrington, Fort Benning. I was your commanding officer during those 6 weeks you spent failing basic training, Blake. The color drained completely from Blake's face. Seth's mouth dropped open. I don't know what you're talking about, Blake tried weakly. You must have me confused with someone else. You washed out after 6 weeks, failed to adapt, couldn't complete the physical requirements, never earned an MOS, let alone became special forces. You were never deployed, never saw combat, never earned a Bronze Star. Seth stood up abruptly. Dude, what the hell? You told me you were a war hero. He's lying, Blake said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. Cassidy watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. She looked stunned by the rapid unraveling of Blake's fabricated military career. I have your discharge papers on file, I said calmly, claiming military honors you never earned is stolen valor, Blake. It's disrespectful to everyone who actually served. Seth backed away from the table. I'm out, man. This is messed up. Blake stood up, knocking his chair backward, his face flushed with humiliation. You don't know anything about me. I could have been special forces if I wanted to. But you weren't, I said simply, and you never will be. Blake looked around wildly, seeing nothing but disgust and shock on the faces surrounding him. Without another word, he turned and practically ran for the exit. Cassidy stared after him, then turned to me. Did that really just happen? I nodded and took a calm sip of my beer. Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think. Blake's dramatic exit left an awkward silence at our table. Cassidy stared at me with wide eyes, trying to process what had just happened. So he was never in the military? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He was, for 6 weeks, I explained. Blake washed out of basic training at Fort Benning, couldn't handle the physical requirements or the discipline, never deployed, never saw combat, never earned any medals. Cassidy's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I feel so stupid for believing him. All those stories seemed so real. That's because he's had plenty of practice telling them, I said. He mixed just enough real terminology with his fiction to sound convincing to civilians. Wesley, the bar owner, approached our table with a concerned expression. Everything okay over here? I saw that guy storm out, pretty upset. I nodded. Just a case of stolen valor. Guy was pretending to be special forces. Sighed. Wesley sighed and shook his head. Blake again. He pulls this routine at least once a week. Different women, same stories. Janelle appeared with fresh drinks for us. On the house? She said, setting them down. That guy's been coming in for months, always claiming to be some kind of war hero. Makes me sick considering my brother actually served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Why do you let him in? Cassidy asked. Janelle shrugged. First time we caught him lying, Wesley banned him for 2 weeks. He came back with some sob story about PTSD and needing support. Hard to turn someone away when they play that card. Well, now you know the truth, I said. He never made it past basic training. Cassidy took a long sip of her drink. I should have noticed something was off, the way he kept changing details about his supposed deployment dates. Don't beat yourself up, I told her. He's practiced at this, knows just enough military jargon to fool most people. Wesley thanked me for handling the situation discreetly. He promised Blake wouldn't be welcome back. My phone rang. It was Terrence calling back with more information. Excuse me a minute, I said to Cassidy, stepping away from the table. Blake's been doing this for years, Terrence told me. We've had reports from bars near 3 different military bases. He shows up, claims to be special forces, uses it to impress women and get free drinks. I wasn't surprised. Any legal action taken? Not yet, but there's enough for a stolen valor case if you want to pursue it. I glanced back at Cassidy, who was talking with Janelle. Send me the details. I'll pass them along to the right people. When I returned to the table, Cassidy looked up with a small smile. So, government consulting, huh? That's a pretty vague job description for someone who is a commanding officer. I laughed. It's intentionally vague. I work with military training programs, helping identify issues and improve processes. Nothing as exciting as Blake's fictional missions. I appreciate how you handled that, she said. You could have embarrassed him much worse, but you just stated the facts. Stolen valor is a serious issue, I explained. People who actually served and sacrificed deserve respect. Blake was disrespecting every real service member with his lies. My phone buzzed with a text from Andre, available to collect statements about the Blake situation if needed, nearby. I showed Cassidy the message. Want to help make sure Blake stops doing this? She nodded firmly. Absolutely. Andre arrived 20 minutes later. He took our statements about Blake's claims and collected contact information from Wesley and Janelle as witnesses. This should be enough to issue a cease and desist, Andre said. If he continues after that, we can pursue more serious charges. After Andre left, Cassidy and I decided to salvage what remained of our evening. We ordered food and more drinks. So what was it really like? She asked. Your actual military experience, I mean. I shared appropriate stories about my service, keeping to non-classified information. The genuine interest in her eyes was refreshing after watching Blake's performance. Much less glamorous than Blake made it sound, I concluded. A lot of waiting, training, and paperwork. The real military isn't like the movies. 2 weeks later, I received confirmation that Blake had been served with an official cease and desist order regarding his false military claims. That same evening, Cassidy and I celebrated our 4th date at a different downtown restaurant. We laughed about our bizarre encounter with Blake. You know, if it weren't for that guy's ridiculous lies, I might never have found out what you really do, Cassidy said, raising her glass. I clinked my glass against hers. Here's to unexpected revelations, and to real heroes, she added with a warm smile. Not the ones who just play pretend.